All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to part two of Understanding the Brain's Roadblocks, Practical Strategies for Learning Success. We are here today with Ann Bleicher. And thank you so much for being back with us today. It was definitely a pleasure to have you the first time, and I know all of us are looking forward to this part two. I know you have a lot to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to you. Just know I will be posting things in the chat for you to notice. There will be some links in there for you. So, Anne, thank you so much. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Dina. I'm super excited to be back with you today to continue our discussion on cognitive areas where students may struggle. If you missed part one in January, I encourage you to go back and watch that video, as much of what we're going to discuss today is a continuation of that. And I believe that Dina will put the link to where that video is housed for you if you want to go back and either refresh your memory, or if you, like I said, didn't have a chance to watch it, you can go back and catch up on that. We do have a lot of material to go over. I will try my very best to leave some time for questions at the end if there are any, but if we run out of time, I will make sure that you have my contact information so you can reach out to me directly. And I also want to let you know that there are several slides in the deck that we are not going to have time to go over today, but you will have access to them in the full slide deck when you can get into that PowerPoint. And so today we're going to be focusing on the working memory index, the visual processing index, and the processing speed index. If you were able to attend part one, you will recall that we talked about the verbal comprehension and fluid reasoning indexes in January. Those two are the most heavily weighted when we look at all of the cognitive areas. When we're looking at these three areas today, working memory is probably the one that has the biggest impact behind those other two. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on working memory, and then I'll touch on visual processing and processing speed. And so we're going to just jump right in. This is just kind of a review of what we looked at in January in terms of the importance of understanding student cognitive abilities and why that matters for what you are doing as teachers. And so, often teachers, after a student goes through evaluation, are very interested in what the academic scores are. But it's really important to understand what those cognitive scores are as well. It does things like identify strengths and weaknesses for students. It informs your instructional strategies. It helps to identify maybe some differentiated instruction that you may need to do. It helps you understand learning styles, and it helps you develop targeted interventions. As a review, these are kind of the five main areas that we look at when we're assessing students on a cognitive assessment. All five of these, so the visual processing, verbal comprehension, fluid reasoning, working memory, and processing speed, all play into that full scale IQ, which is kind of what the overall ability level is. You'll notice on here that before each of those, visual processing, verbal comprehension, etc., that they have a G before them. And we talked quite a bit in January about what G is. I just have a slide to kind of refresh your memory. If you were here and if you weren't here, just to give you a little bit of foundational knowledge before we jump into the content. So G really is like an overall ability level. It's what that full scale IQ number is. And it's not just about your learned knowledge, it's more about the ability to learn and reason new things. We would expect over the course of a lifetime, if you had multiple IQ tests, that your G would remain relatively stable, meaning if you've taken 5 IQ tests, we would expect that those scores would be, would stay within a stable range over the course of the lifetime. The only thing that would change that is if you have like a traumatic brain injury or something that, that happened that changed how your brain processes information. And so in terms of the importance of understanding G, it's really important as teachers, it helps you understand differences in terms of how students access instruction. And not so much about how much they care or how capable they are. Often when students have cognitive deficits, teachers sometimes believe that they just don't care, they're not engaged, but in reality, they have that underlying deficits that's impacting how they're accessing their education. And so when instruction matches how students process information, we can see better accuracy, engagement, independence, and really small intentional changes in your instruction can make a significant difference across all content areas. Often when I'm talking with teachers as I travel across the state, you have a lot on your plate, right? And so I think sometimes it's overwhelming for teachers to think about, well, how can I add even more instruction and more goal areas and more, whatever to what I already have to do with these students. And so what I hope you walk away with today is that it doesn't have to be a separate component of an IEP or of services that you're addressing with students. It can be something that's done in conjunction with the services that you are already providing. So since now that we've looked at cognitive indexes more broadly, I want to really focus in on one index that has a significant impact on classroom learning, which is working memory. This is also referred to as sequential processing or short-term working memory, and it's your ability to hold information in your mind and use it within a few seconds. So typically, when we take in information, we can hold it for about 15 to 20 seconds. And if you haven't somehow applied that to whatever it is you're working on, it's going to probably be gone. It plays a critical role in how students hold information, following directions, completing multi-step tasks, those kinds of things. When students have a deficit in working memory, they may understand the content, but they struggle to keep all of the pieces active enough to respond accurately to that content. Working memory and executive functioning deficits are particularly common among students that have ADHD. However, it's not exclusive to that population. For students, the importance of identifying and addressing this particular cognitive weakness cannot be overstated because it is the first mode that we take in information, right? And if you can't keep things in your working memory long enough to attach it to new learning, then it doesn't transfer to your long-term memory, which then makes it virtually impossible to later retrieve that and then apply what you've already learned to new learning so that that scaffold continues. Frequently, what we see is that instructional efforts focus primarily on the academic needs as a result of these deficits. So a student might have difficulty in reading comprehension because they can't remember, if they're reading like a long chapter, they can't remember what they read at the beginning of the chapter because they have a working memory deficit. And so the result of that deficit is a reading comprehension problem. And if we can address both of those concurrently, the outcomes for those students are going to be much greater. Again, because it's not necessarily that they're incapable of learning the content, it's just that that is a barrier to them being able to keep that in their memory and then transfer it to long-term memory. So before we talk about working memory in more technical terms, I want to show you a short clip that gives a glimpse into what working memory breakdown can look like in real time. This is a clip from Saturday Night Live that really exaggerates what working memory deficits look like, but the underlying challenge is very real. You're going to see several people in this little play trying to hold on to information, respond, and keep track of what's happening, and then losing pieces of that along the way. And as you watch this, I'd like you to pay attention to how quickly the information is lost, how the responses derail, and how difficult it becomes to stay on task when we're asking them to hold on to too much information at one time. So this is similar to what many students with working memory deficits experience, and I would wager to guess that you will probably think of students that you saw today that you have experienced this with. And while you may not see that working memory deficit manifest all the time, it is often enough that it has a pretty significant impact. Okay, so I don't know how many of you have students that you can relate to with that, or have students like Vernon, or these are the students that you're having a class discussion and they raise their hands and like, I know, and then you call on them and then it's just gone. That is what working memory looks like. So now that we have a clearer picture of what it is and how it manifests, the next step is to look at how that shows up in different content areas. Working memory isn't just a single classroom skill. As I said, it has a pretty broad impact across all content areas. And so you may see deficits in reading comprehension, writing, science, oral language. Specifically in reading comprehension, students may have a hard time holding on to key details, as I said, or if they're reading a long book and remembering what happened. They may have a difficult time weeding out like not as important information and getting caught kind of in the details of that they lose the main gist of the text. In writing, organizing ideas, keeping their writing coherent, because they may start a paragraph and then forget what it is they're talking about and go down a rabbit hole and start talking about something else. In science, things like doing experiments and mixing chemicals in the right order. And, if teachers say do this, then this, then this, and you're working with chemicals, that could have potentially not a good outcome for those students that struggle with working memory. In oral language, if you're having a class discussion, students having a hard time holding on to what it is they want to say or how they're going to respond, and you're thinking about that when you're talking with somebody else, and then when it comes time for them to respond, they may struggle with even remembering what was being said so that they can formulate a response for that. In math, it could be things like long math problems, doing mental math, those kinds of things. There are two kind of primary classifications, I guess, of working memory. The first one is auditory working memory, and this is just how you take in information that you hear and manipulate that so that you can do something with the information. In the classroom, it's heavily involved for listening to directions, following multi-step verbal directions, participating in discussions. That's all auditory working memory. When that is weak for students, they may miss steps, forget parts of directions, only remember the last thing that was said. So you saw that in that little Saturday Night Live skit where he gave the entire line, but the guy was only able to remember the last part of it. That's very typical of students that struggle with working memory. And then often what happens is that when students struggle in this area, teachers misinterpret that as inattention or non-compliance, when in reality, the student truly cannot retain information long enough to respond accurately. And then for visual working memory, this is what you take in visually and able to hold on to that and manipulate information. And so things like copying from the board accurately, holding a mental image of a math equation to be able to solve it. In reading, for words that you cannot sound out, so sight words. If students can't remember visually how letters look, a lot of times, and I think we do it without even realizing that we're doing it, but like the word light, for example, when you have strong visual working memory intact, you're going to remember the shapes of the letters and which letters are tall, which drop below the line, those kinds of things. And so often we see when students can't recall even how to spell those words, that it wouldn't be unusual for them to have some visual working memory deficits as well. When visual working memory is weak in the classroom, students might lose their place. They might forget visual details, struggle to transfer information accurately, all of those kinds of things. And then types of instructional supports that may be helpful is to externalize that visual information. So providing templates and visual models, consistent layouts that you've taught students how to use will all help reduce those demands. This is just kind of a summary of the key differences between auditory working memory and visual working memory. Both are essential and often work together. However, deficits can occur in either one of them. Um, and so it just, if you have a good understanding of where exactly the deficit is, then you have a good understanding of what types of supports you might have to put in place. And so, for example, if a student has a deficit in auditory working memory, visual aids would be helpful. The opposite of that is also true. If they have visual memory needs, then verbal cues would be helpful. Chunking, repetition, multimodal instruction for both are super effective. In terms of things that you would look for in students, this is just kind of an example of things that you might observe in the classroom of students that you work with. And I have these kind of grouped into 3 different buckets. And so the first one on the left is just following multi-step directions. The one in the middle is being able to hold on to and manipulate information, types of behaviors that you might see. And then the one on the right is task initiation and completion type things. Students may demonstrate understanding when information is presented one step at a time, but they struggle when they have to hold multiple things in place. So these behaviors often appear across content areas and over time, but it helps you as an educator to distinguish working memory challenges from motivation or skill deficits. And so once you kind of have what those observations are, then that sets you up nicely to kind of follow the golden thread of the IEP. And so in this example, the observation is that the student has difficulty following multi-step directions, and so they need repeated instructions or break tasks into smaller parts. And so you take that information, and that golden thread really begins with what we observe in the classroom, not necessarily with what the test score says or what we think services should or shouldn't be. And you'll notice here that we're not yet jumping to instructional strategies. This phase really is about identifying what the needs are and then putting those into the present levels, and then that follows through with the IEP with aligning goals and accommodations. Observations should really focus on patterns of performance. And so you can see on this example PLOF statement, it kind of just goes through that the teacher reports that the student has difficulty following multi-step verbal directions. It specifies when that's being seen. So on one step, if directions are more than one step. It's also noted in the PLAF that it's not necessarily due to a lack of understanding of the content, but about whether or not they can complete those tasks accurately. And then how that working memory deficit impacts the student's ability to initiate and complete classroom tasks. So often what we see is that the student struggles with task initiation or completing classroom tasks across content areas. This is just kind of taking it a step further and identifying what is causing that. So then when you take all of that data combined, it indicates a need for specially designed instruction to support working memory through explicit instruction and structured supports so that you reduce that cognitive load. So in the PLAF, you want to take those observations, so the observations from this slide, and translate that into what the educational impact is. And then from there, you can identify a goal that may target that impact versus just one that is loosely tied to an academic skill. And so in this example, when given a task involving 3 to 4 sequential steps, the student will independently complete all steps in the correct order with no more than one adult prompt in 4 out of 5 trials. And so you're working on task analysis. I mean, you're working on work completion, task initiation, but your SDI is going to focus on how to achieve that. And we're going to talk about instructional strategies in just a minute. And then from your goal, then you have options for accommodations that may be appropriate for those students. So when goals and accommodations align with the PLAF statement, instruction becomes intentional, and then progress monitoring becomes meaningful, and it just kind of follows that golden thread of the IEP very nicely. So in terms of instructional strategies, this shift takes us from what the IEP says to what teachers are actually going to do, and that's where you come in. For students with working memory deficits, SDI focuses really on teaching compensatory habits. So you're basically going to be training the brain to build scaffolding around the bottleneck that's happening because of the working memory deficit. So the strategy that I'm going to kind of focus on for the purposes of this training, and like I said, there's additional slides in the slide deck, and also some additional information that you can access that has additional SDI strategies that you can look at and try out in the classroom. But we're going to talk about chunking today, and this is an example of direct instruction that intentionally changes how the information is presented so that it's manageable for students that have cognitive processing needs. So with chunking, a lot of you are probably familiar with this. Rather than expecting students to independently organize large amounts of information, we're teaching them how to break content into smaller, meaningful units. And so in this example, we're teaching the students to group 10 spelling words into 3 categories. So words that have TH, words that have CH, and then any outlier words. And so the student, what we're teaching them to do is to hold 3 chunks in their memory rather than 10 individual items. And in this particular strategy, it really requires explicit modeling and guided practice. And so we start with I do, and then we do, and then you do, kind of a format. Instructional strategies like chunking help provide common breakdowns we see in the classroom. Things like students starting tasks incorrectly or before they understand what they're supposed to do, skipping steps. For students that appear disengaged, this gives them something to kind of hold on to as they're learning how to do this. So chunking addresses that overload directly by making expectations clear and more accessible to them. And so the first step is you modeling as the instructor how your brain chunks so that it really is that kind of think aloud mentality. I think often we assume that students just know how to do it intuitively. And so the point of this specially designed instruction is that you are walking them through. So for example, I see that think and bath both have TH in them. I'm going to put them in the TH pile, so I only have to remember one rule for both words. And so you're just walking them through what that looks like. And then in the second step, you are doing it together. And so instead of like in the first step, you might do 1 or 2, and then you work with them to complete the rest of that chunking for those 10 words. And then there's prompting that you can give to them. So if they struggle, things like, does this word look like the others in the pile, or is it an outlier? So again, you're just reinforcing what your thinking process is and how you are working through that. And then in the third step, you're going to give them another group of words and see if they can apply that learning to what you have modeled for them. And then in terms of how this plays out in the IEP, when you're writing this into an IEP, you have to distinguish between what the goal is, so what they will do, and the SDI, how you'll teach it. And so from a goal perspective, by such and such a date, when presented with a list of 10 to 12 multi-step items or information pieces, the student will independently categorize chunk into 3 to 4 thematic groups with 80% accuracy, and then how you're going to measure that. And then in the service grid or in the PLAF, you're going to say that they need explicit instruction in cognitive chunking and pattern recognition. So instead of just a goal that says they're going to learn the spelling rules for TH, CH, and outlier words, you're layering in that additional cognitive deficit and really addressing both things at the same time. And then that helps you then determine what kind of accommodations and supports that may need to be put in place as well. So things like graphic organizers for sorting information, they may need extended time for the chunking process. Really, with all three of these areas that we're going to talk about today, a lot of times it's just going to be about teaching them how to use ultimately what's going to be accommodations in their IEP, but initially they require some specially designed instruction around that so that they know what to do with that. In kind of a real life classroom setting, chunking is often associated just with spelling, but you can really, its true power lies in executive functioning. And so it's super easy to apply that across all grade bands, all grade levels, for students that are struggling with working memory or even processing speed. Often when they have a long list of requirements, that leads to kind of task paralysis. And if we teach them how to chunk their day, we're building a scaffold to kind of work around that bottleneck. So in social studies, for example, instead of asking them to memorize or summarize 10 random facts about explorers, for example, we'll teach them how to categorize those into 3 distinct chapters or 3 distinct buckets of information so that they can better hold on to that information. Same thing for computer science, in art, if they consistently have a cleanup list that they have to do for students that struggle with working memory, they may get 1 or 2 things on there, but teaching them how to chunk that. In general, when you're using chunking as an instructional strategy, you want to kind of keep it to 3. Students that have working memory deficits can typically hold on to 3 pieces of information more effectively than say like 5 or 10. And so that just helps them reduce how much information they have to process at one time. This handout will give you a lot more information on just kind of some universal strategies, some more examples of SDI, just a lot of information around working memory. So in general, when we're talking about working memory and interventions that you're going to provide as an educator, you can support a student's cognitive engine, so to speak, by externalizing information for them, bridging with a visual gap, depending on where their deficit is. If they have visual working memory needs, then it would be with a verbal gap, and then opposite. Build time for the brain to catch up, so that they have some time to process that information, and then break complex tasks into shorter chunks so that they can have a better chance of being able to have that information transferred to their long-term memory. Overall, supporting working memory improves accuracy, task completion, and student confidence. And really, if you can, like I said, if you can address that in conjunction with whatever the academic needs are, you're probably going to see students regress much more quickly because you're addressing what is having the biggest impact on that academic area. So we've been talking about how much information students have to hold in their working memory. The next piece is to consider how students take in and organize information visually. Visual spatial deficit or visual spatial processing affects how students interpret what they see, and that in turn has a direct impact on learning. So I'm going to show you this short video clip, and it just goes into a little bit of detail about what visual processing is and how much it can impact what we see with the students that we work with.
Visual processing issues means the brain is not processing the information being received by the eyes. It can impact reading, writing, and language. This time of year, parents are trying to find answers to why their children are struggling more than their peers at those foundational skills. Visual processing delays could be to blame, and you might not even know it. First grader Jesse Cross looks just like other kids his age. But the 6-year-old had been struggling with something no one could see.
He also was struggling with sports, reading, writing, just typical things that I was like, oh, he's just a boy. He'll grow out of those things.
Jesse was seeing double.
I mean, he had been to the eye doctor. He'd passed all the exams multiple times.
Even his mom didn't know.
And for kids and for adults, we see what we think is normal. But for a kid, they don't know what they're seeing is not normal. They don't realize that something is not right.
Jesse's mom had him evaluated at WOW Vision Therapy in St. Joseph.
And we diagnosed him with convergence insufficiency, was an inability to converge the eyes, and difficulty tracking. He had trouble moving his eyes across the page at a level that was age appropriate. He was way below what he should be able to for his age.
Turns out Jesse's struggles with reading fluency, focusing, and letter reversal was actually a lack of communication between his two eyes, nerves, and muscles.
What we're describing is not an eye problem, it is a brain thing.
Optometrist Dr. Dan Fortenbacher is the founder of WOW Vision Therapy, which focuses on developmental vision and rehabilitation. It's a subspecialty of optometry.
I think the experience that I have has also helped me to understand the impact that vision problems can have on a child's reading performance, their learning ability, their ability to pay attention in the classroom, their handwriting skills.
Fortenbacher says symptoms of visual processing issues might include poor handwriting, reversing letters or words, or losing their place when reading. There are a long list of visual problems that can impact a child's academic success and may require this kind of therapy. Some are not well known and often overlooked or misdiagnosed.
A very common theme with the children we see is that they have attentional problems and therefore can be labeled with ADHD, or the parents are just concerned their child can't pay attention well and just assume it's just because they are who they are. But in general, we're looking at vision impacts your ability to make sense of what you see, and that impacts your ability to stay focused.
Similar to other rehabilitation therapies like occupational or speech therapy, therapy at WOW is a series of activities guided by a vision therapist.
But what I emphasize to parents is vision therapy is not eye exercises. We're not treating your eyes, we're not treating the muscles, we're really treating your brain's ability to coordinate your eyes, to take in that information and then process that information so you can make sense of it and apply it to language in reading.
Fortenbacher says once the brain knows what to do, most often after a few months, therapy is no longer needed. That's the case with Jesse.
His ability to read went from a first grade level, basic, barely first grade level, to a third grade level. His symptoms of headaches and eye strain went away.
Jesse's mom has seen other major improvements, including in his coordination, attention, and anxiety.
And now how do you feel about his future?
Oh, great. I'm super excited for next year to see how much he can improve over the summer.
I've put much more information on this and other visual problems that could impact learning on this story on our website. Also, check out Monday's story about two other often hidden issues impacting kids: developmental language disorder.
Okay. So I think the biggest takeaway from that is when that mom said, as adults, we know if things don't look right, but kids, especially if they have visual spatial deficits, that's how they've always seen things. And so it is super easy to miss. And I would just encourage you, if things are not lining up when you're looking at evaluations with students, it might be something that you need to look into deeper to better kind of quantify what might be going on visually, or check with the person that did the evaluations to see if they noticed anything. Often when we're doing those evaluations, we'll see other signs of maybe the eyes are not working correctly that may warrant some additional assessment. So visual spatial processing is, like I said, the ability to think about visual patterns. And again, I just want to reiterate that it doesn't have anything to do with visual acuity or 20/20 vision. It has to do with how your eyes work together to process information. It does have or can have an impact on basic reading skills, reading fluency, math calculation, writing, staying within the margins on the lines, copying from boards. A lot of times students, you'll see students start to have a lot of difficulty or complain about like headaches, for example, when they get to like end of second, beginning of third grade, because now all of a sudden they're getting into taking notes and they're copying from that board, and that constant like back and forth between a paper that's in front of them to the board and back really puts a strain on those muscles. And so if that's something that you're noticing with students, it would be worth exploring that more. In terms of application across other content areas in social studies, things like reading maps, interpreting diagrams in science, drawing from models, choreographing, spatial positioning, if they're in PE and they seem like they're having a hard time organizing their space on the field, those could all be potential signs of that. Difficulties in this area can impact access, and in the IEP, visual spatial needs often show up in present levels as difficulty with organization, alignment, spacing, visual tracking, all of those things that we just talked about. The SDI that comes out of a result of that may need to include explicit instruction on how to interpret visual information. So again, when we're talking about SDI for these three cognitive indexes in particular today, it may not be SDI that is long term. It may be, as I said earlier, SDI to teach them how to use their accommodations and access those, how to interpret when they have a map versus a diagram. And then once they have those skills in place, you wouldn't necessarily need the SDI to continue from that. And it may be able to transition then into just strictly accommodations. But in the present levels, I gave some examples of what that might look like for reading, math, writing, and then some additional examples of what measurable annual goals may look like for that. Students that have deficits in visual spatial area may need some additional related service support. And so it wouldn't be unusual to have like occupational therapy services on an IEP to work on visual motor integration and handwriting. It may not be unusual for like a special education teacher to have to provide some support. And then supplementary aids and services. This is often where we see this show up on IEPs when we're looking at files, are accommodations. So things like preferential seating, materials, you could have some accommodations around that to increase the white space so there's just not as much visual information in front of the student. They may need extended time due to the fact that it takes them longer to process visual information. Really, the goal of the accommodation should be around reducing the visual noise and the cognitive load around that. In terms of instructional strategies, visual spatial needs require explicit strategies that clarify visual information and support organization. And there are quite a few examples of these in the slide deck, and I tried to span those kind of across multiple grades. And really, the strategies that you're teaching students are designed to reduce visual confusion while maintaining academic expectations. And so you really are providing kind of a bridge between what their processing deficit is and what the academic visual demands are. So visual spatial SDI involves explicitly teaching students how to interpret visual information. This could include things like direct instruction and how to use visual models, process maps, graphic organizers, or structured templates, rather than assuming that students will intuitively understand them. So again, you're teaching them how to use those tools, and then you gradually fade out that instruction so that they can use them independently. So visual spatial SDI clarifies how students see the task so that they can focus on what it is that they're learning. So this is just an example, and you have more details about this in your materials, so I'm going to go over it fairly quickly. It just shows how instruction can be intentionally designed to support visual spatial processing. This is called the spatial anchoring method. And so the first step focuses on providing environmental modifications. So in this case, you're using graph paper or templates so that the page, rather than the student's brain, is handling the alignment of a math problem. And then in step 2, you're going to teach them how to color code kind of directional lanes. And so the ones place, the tens place, however, whatever you're working on, which helps the students track vertically, and it reduces that visual confusion for them. And then you're going to, as part of your instruction, teach them using explicit spatial language. And so instead of just saying, put the 3 here, you're going to walk them through what that looks like. So we start in the bottom right yellow box, we move straight up to the top right yellow box. You're putting, like, if you almost think of it as if you're working with a student that has a visual impairment, you have to verbalize for them exactly what is happening. This would be a very similar concept to that. And then in step 4, you're going to teach the student to use a physical placeholder anchor so that they understand why they're doing that. That serves as a concrete anchor, and it makes the invisible concept of shifting place value visible and intentional for them. And then in step 5, it's a self-correction checklist, and this is a great skill to teach students so that they have a way to check what it is that they just did. And it also builds metacognition. So it teaches students how to check spatial accuracy rather than relying on just what it looks like to them. So it's specially designed instruction because it changes how the task is structured so that students can access it accurately. So since we're talking about visual spatial, I created a graphic that kind of walks you through that. And so it goes through each step, shows you what the color coding looks like, and then how you talk students through that. And what this does is that it shifts the focus so that the page does the remembering instead of relying on the student's ability to visually process that. And so then we move into what does that look like in an IEP document. And again, it's that golden thread. You have the PLAF statement, the annual goal, then it goes into accommodations. And so in the IEP, this levels of support for, let's say, for example, that the student has an identified deficit in math calculation, but they also have a visual spatial processing difficulty. The PLAF statement is going to show you or tell you how that impacts them. So we've identified that they have a math calculation need. We've identified what that looks like in terms of misalignment of numbers, difficulty tracking columns, etc. And then we identify how that impacts their ability to organize written math work. And so you just kind of step through all of that. And then that leads you, similar to what we did with working memory, it leads you into what an annual goal would look like. And what I want you to notice here is that you're addressing math calculation, you're addressing the visual spatial processing deficit, but you're not watering down the rigor of what is expected of the student. And then that leads you into accommodations. In the slide deck, there's an additional strategy that's outlined as well as in your materials on another strategy that you can use for organizing a written paragraph. I'm just going to show you the graphic that goes with that, just to kind of show you that, again, it provides a spatial blueprint for writing. And so in this example, you have the indentation marker for the students, the topic sentences in green. And so you teach students how to do this so that, and this would work for working memory. It would work really for any of the cognitive areas that we've talked about so far. You teach them how to identify what the supporting details are, and then, what their concluding sentence is going to be, where they stop. And so, one of the things you can do when you're writing is to get all of that down, and then you've taught them this strategy, and then that helps them organize their writing. And then, as I said, there is in the resources a visual spatial processing handout that explains in depth each of those areas. So the takeaway for this is that if you explicitly address visual spatial access through instructional strategies and supports, As an IEP team, you can then ensure that students are assessed and taught based on their true abilities rather than their visual processing limitations. They may legitimately have a written expression learning disability, but they also have a visual spatial processing deficit. And so if you can address both of those, that's going to give you more bang for your buck. So the last area that we're going to talk about is processing speed. And this one's a little bit different from the first two because it talks about how efficiently students can act on information once they have it. Processing speed really is about the ability to fluently and automatically perform tasks, especially when you're under pressure. So things like reading fluency, the speeded math fact test that we love to give when students are in lower elementary grades. It does have a relationship to reading, writing, and math, especially in the earlier stages of learning. Because we want some things to be automated so that they don't get bogged down in that as they continue to scaffold new learning. But students with processing speed, for some, that's really difficult. In terms of how we look at that when we're giving cognitive assessments, typically those assessments include like visual scanning type of tasks. So like on the WISC-5, for example, it's going to be the coding or the cancellation task where we're just asking students to visually scan quickly as fast as they can to cross out things that it just depends on what the target is. But it strictly is a timed assessment. We also look at like visual motor integration, so the coordination between the eyes. Again, goes hand in hand with that visual spatial potentially. Mental flexibility, so the ability to shift quickly from one item to the next without losing the thread of the task. Those are all ways to look at processing speed. What we're doing, what happens often with students that have processing speed deficits is that a low score, when you see that on an assessment, for example, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have a slow brain. It could mean any number of things. It could mean that they're perfectionists and they want it to be exactly right. It could mean that there's some fine motor challenges that kind of slow down their mental processing. It could be that the student has some anxiety. I often tested students where I had to be very sneaky, especially around like reading fluency, because a lot of times students will say, is this timed? And if they think that they're being timed, then that automatically like causes them to freeze. On here, let me just check the time. I'm going to skip this video. It just kind of gives a synopsis of what slow processing speed is. It says it probably much more eloquently than I just did, but I would encourage you to go back and watch that. And as you're watching that, think about students who seem capable but struggle with like pace, stamina, or time pressure. Our goal really is not to speed students up, but really to understand their profile and support them with the right accommodations and expectations. Okay, so in terms of how processing speed affects learning in different content areas, we often tend to really focus in on reading, math, and writing. I wanted to just kind of point out the science, social studies, fine arts, PE, and fine arts struggling with timing, rhythm, quickly adjusting movements. Those would all be potential things that you would observe in students that have processing speed deficits. I often wonder as I'm getting older and my husband's talking to me, and I kind of have those moments more and more where like his mouth is moving and I can see his mouth is moving and I can hear him just fine. And then it takes me like a minute for my brain to catch up. And I'm sure you've worked with students or you've felt that even yourself. It just is that slower processing. And so when we think about tying that to special education services, that might look like direct instruction and fluency, academic support from a special education teacher, potentially speech language services for acceptive receptive delays that impact processing. In occupational therapy, if motor planning or handwriting slows task completion, that might be some support services that need to be in place. And when we think about specially designed instruction for processing speed, we're not just waiting for kids to catch up, or we shouldn't be waiting for them to catch up. We really need to teach them how to compress their ideas and prioritize their output. And so the goal of this specially designed instruction is to transition the student from a passive waiter to kind of an active manager of their own cognitive tempo. So in this first example, you may have to teach this to students, and I wouldn't anticipate that it would take very long, but it's just kind of the 60-second brain dump where you work with students to get them out of that kind of blank page phase, and you explicitly teach them to externalize their thoughts before their memory kind of gives out on them. And so you teach them to set a timer and use that 60 seconds to just jot down everything that's related to the task that they're about to work on. And then what you're teaching them during that time is you're training them to bypass that perfectionism or filter that often slows them down with low processing speed. Similarly, on predictive scanning, you are going to help them and teach them how to anticipate what information is coming next. So it's not about going faster, it's really about starting smarter. And so you're going to teach them how to preview key features of a text, and that reduces the amount of decision-making time that's required once the task begins. Again, there are several slides on what that looks like with an IEP. I want to get to a specific strategy, so I'm going to skip through those. In terms of how that plays out in the classroom, there is a information in the handouts for each of these 3 strategies. For the purposes of the next few minutes, I'm going to really focus in depth on gisting to show how that plays out instructionally. And so we're really trying to get students to move from something that may be completely overwhelming them and teaching them how to work through, in this example, it's going to be a long text to reduce the cognitive load. And so here's an example of a reading passage that may be put in front of students. And for those that have processing speed deficits, this is what they deal with all day long potentially, and it's just noise, and they can't figure out what's important, what's not important. And so the issue here is how much cognitive work it requires before a student can even start a task. In gisting, the first thing we do is we teach kids how to isolate the nouns. In this example, in case there's any ELA teachers out there, I just want to clarify that for this example, the nouns were identified based on meaning and context and not necessarily a part of speech isolation, in case you're wondering if there are some words highlighted versus others that may not be. So nothing is deleted in this passage. We're just teaching them how to kind of to start identifying what is important. And while that took away a lot from that, it still might be too much. And so we're going to take away the abstract nouns and just leave it with what the concrete nouns are. These are easier for the brain to hold on to. And you're teaching students how to do this. And in those materials, like I said, there are step-by-step instructions for how you can do that. And then to make the passage even more accessible, we want to teach them how to narrow it down to really the most important nouns. So then you're left with just students, directions, tasks, and assignments. And then you can narrow that down even further to kind of what the core actors are. In this case, it would be students and tasks. So now that we've stripped the passage down to the who and the what, we're going to ask a different question about what it is that's actually happening. So nouns give students something to hold on to, but it doesn't alone, they don't alone tell them what they have to do. And so we are going to then go back and isolate the verbs. And then we're going to continue to just pare that down until you get to kind of the three main verbs. And so the bottom line of that gisting activity is that students misunderstand tasks. And so you've taken that very long passage and you've taught them how to narrow that down. This can be super helpful with long chapters in a textbook, those kinds of things. Again, here's that handout that is available to you for processing speed. It specifically talks in depth with some accompanying materials for the gisting strategy. It also goes over the signal habit and the capture method that was highlighted in that slide a few slides ago. And so we're not going to have time for questions and comments. I'm sorry, I tried very hard to do that. But here is my contact information if you have any questions. Ultimately, what I hope you guys walk away with today and from the training in January is that when IEPs and instruction are aligned to cognitive needs, we create clearer pathways for students to engage, respond, and succeed. I would also ask that you fill out the evaluation form. I would love your feedback around what was helpful, as well as any other topics that may be of interest to you as we think about future trainings moving forward. I really appreciate your time this afternoon, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
And thank you so much. Again, this was amazing content, a lot covered. And as Anne mentioned, you will have the recording and the materials that will include all of these slides. In fact, there will be some bonus slides that did not get covered. So you'll have access to all of those things. And I have put that in the chat. As Anne mentioned, this is the QR code for the evaluation. I have also put it in the chat for you to go to a direct link if that's easier. And the handouts are there. Again, thank you so much for your time. We know that it's valuable and we appreciate you being here. And Anne, again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And all of your wonderful preparation and expertise.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everyone.